Today, I want to introduce to you the Romantic period, which basically comes after we finish um, the Renaissance, the Modern period, the Victorian period, and after we have seen last class lesson about Shakespeare and other writers from the Renaissance. Today we're going to focus on the Romantic period, which basically goes from 1798 until 1832. And it's important to say that this period is related to rebels and dreamers, let's say so, because it was a period when uh, historically, after nearly a century of progress in science and industry, the faith of poets in reason was ended, right? Since the period before the Romantic period was basically centered on science and industry, uh, in 18th century, poets had celebrated the power of human understanding. So there's more their most bitter satire could say no more than humanity is unreasonable. So during this period, for example, we have William Blake, we have William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, and also John Keats. Um, Wordsworth marked the end of the century with the warning our meddling intellect misshape the viticulous forms of thing we murder to dissect. So, in the ensuing period, which was named the Romantic period by all the historians, during the late 1800s, nearly all the attitudes and tendencies of the 18th century, classicism and rationalism were redefined and changed dramatically. To understand how these changes occurred, it is necessary to examine not only the impact, right, of events in England, but also the effects of the social political upheavals that began taking place in other parts of the world, right? Um, During this period, we have revolution reaction. Some of the defining events of our British thought and politics at the end of the 18th century took place not in England but in France, as you know, the French Revolution, which began the 14th of July, 1789, when a mob stormed the Bastille in Paris prison for political prisoners. That's one of the events most important to take into account that triggered the beginning of the Romantic period. Okay. Um, Also, uh, regarding on literature, um, as I said, British Romantic writers responded to the climate of their time. Their new interest in the trials and dreams of the common people and their desire for radical change developed out of the democratic idealism that characterized the early part of the French Revolution. So basically, in this period, people start focusing more on people, right? Not on the industry, on science. They start basically focusing on people, right? The common people. Um, the Romantic age in British poetry is important also. And during Romanticism was a movement that affected not only literature but also the other arts, such music, architecture, uh, painting, etc., etc., etc. Right? So let's continue and let's see what inspired the so-called the Romantic Revolution. And as I said at the beginning, the main fact that triggered the Romantic period was the French Revolution, with its famous motto: Liberté, Égalité, and Fraternité, which means um, freedom, equality, and fraternity. That's the translation into English, right? So, um, it was mainly inspired in the French Revolution, right? During the 1788 and 1789. And its watchwords, liberty, equality, and fraternity, are one of the main topics that basically moved the writers and literature from the period. And it was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Enlightenment. As I said, since in the during the 16 and 1700, most of the intellectual were basically centered on science and the findings of science. Um, they center on machines, on development of new form of production, of mass production, and they forgot what was, according to some writer of this period, was important: people. They left aside people, and they basically uh, what they tried to do during this period is try to rebirth, to re-enhance, and to show the potential of how these common people lived, especially in England. And what is the or what are the main characteristic of the Romantic period? Basically, we have that writers focus their work on emotions and feelings. Most of the word, um, most of the work, sorry, basically included literature that conveyed emotion and feeling, and were basically um, directed to how people felt, right? And it's also important to emphasize that the romantic view of nature was quite different from that of the 18th century literature. Nature was not a force to be tamed and analyzed scientifically. Rather, it was a wild, free force that could inspire poets to instinctive spiritual um, understanding. So, uh, during this period, for example, we have lyrical ballads, which was coolly received at first, but with Rhine, it came to be regarded as the cornerstone of British Romantic age, the ballads, right? The poems. Also, with time, Wordsworth, for example, and Coleridge became respected members of Britain's literature, of the establishment, and their political thinking, deeply marked by events in France, grew more narrative, and their literary ideas began to seem less radical than they once had. Um, Also, imaginations leading to originality. As I said, people focus mostly on what they see and what they were feeling about, than uh, trying to explain scientifically how things work. That's something that we have to consider. And also, it's not less important to emphasize that during this period there was a revival of medievalism beyond rationalism and classicist ideas. People went back to study works that basically um, focused on emotions, right? On people's life. And this was something that you could see in the works during this period. Also, it's important to mention love for nature, as I said, with emotions as awe, terror, and passion, and inspiration. Nature provides the basis of epistemology for human thoughts and art and actions. During the Romantic period, people start focusing and thinking about nature as the source of what we could express as a human and show our emotion as a person in society. Also, during this period, it's important to mention that lyricism and subjectivity were something that were uh, very common in the literature of the period. Love for simplicity as well, as I said, because people, um, especially writers, focus, as I said, on nature instead of trying to explain scientifically something, and folk literature as expounded in Wordsworth's idea of poetic diction. Um, all, it's also interesting to emphasize that exoticizing the familiar and familiarizing the exotic was quite a revolution during this period. In literature, we have that writer try to focus on real things, trying to explain things that were hard to understand. Sentimental, because basically they try to present how people felt, how people live, and how people expressed their feeling during this period, and also over imaginative, since we have a very interesting work, very interesting creation that used a lot of imagination to explore human um, understanding and human emotion. Um, During the Romantic period, poet was one of the comfortable country gentlemen. Um, in this case, we have to name William Wordsworth, for example. And Wordsworth, a poet who was a revolutionary new vision of the natural world, or a country gentleman who merely appreciated and tamed landscape. And we have that in this case that William Wordsworth, for example, was a visionary poet, and also as he tried to present things taking into consideration philosophy, right? And he give us a clear and comprehensive expression of what we today so striking lack of an organic unitary vision of man and nature, right? Of the human mind, the earth, and the heavens, all activated by one spirit in all humanist relationship. That's one of the perception that George Mayer wrote about William Wordsworth. In literature, as I said, we have, for example, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was one of the writer who, during this period, emphasized how we could present literature work, and a repetition in the infinite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Invites to a new form of nature and human nature. So they try to focus, as I said, on people's life, on how people live, and try to understand the relationship of um, human being with the natural environment in this case. That's what they try to present basically with the literary works. And we have, for example, also William Wordsworth, which who was one of the authors that try to present, as I said, try to understand um, uh, how he saw the nature and how he saw man, basically. And he defined that form of act. Also, we have Lord Byron, George Lord Byron, and although critics responded unfavorably to his early poetry, Byron, for example, persisted and finally achieved success when he published the first two cantos. He published Childe Harold's Pilgrimage in 1812, and a handsome, egotistical, and aloof Byron became the darling of elegant society, but not for long. Shocked by his radical politics and scandalous love of affairs, he was not a very conventional writer, and he wrote in 1810 Don Juan, where he explored nature's cruelty and also beauty. And it's also important to emphasize Johann Wolfgang Goethe, a German writer, The Sorrows of John Werther, which is one of his famous work, and which basically emphasizes the emotion on living beyond a polite society. And Johann Wolfgang von Goethe also wrote Faust, which was one of his famous work that is known all around the world in literature. And basically, when we see this image, we can see that during this period there was an special emphasis on nature, and nature as a fantasy and as a reality, as well as nature as a source to understand human being and humans uh, approach to nature. So they went back to the root, sorry. So they tried to emphasize and they tried to understand how spectacular was nature to understand humans' relationship and humans' form of feeling and thought. Well, that's basically a short introduction to the um, romantic period, and I want to leave this short proverb by Johann Goethe, which say, "To think is easy, to act is hard, but the hardest thing in the world in to act is in accordance with your thinking," and that is like to be coherent, right? So thank you very much, and this is basically the short presentation on Romanticism for British literature.